very much for the introduction. I should add that I'm not exactly at the École des Études, but some of my best friends are.
I don't know if this is on.
And even I get confused. No, it's just that I'm not speaking straight in the mic, but now that I am, it helps. I'm very pleased to be here and to start again this discussion. You may wonder why we chose to have it today, not just more or less now, but today. And I'll give you one reason, is that it was announced today in French media that François Hollande was finally getting married. And everyone said, wow, this really illustrates his dedication to marriage for all. That's his contribution. But of course, it's April Fool's Day, and that's maybe one reason why we chose to have this event today. There's a second reason, is that it's Easter Monday. And it would have been interesting to have a discussion about this, given the importance of the Catholic Church in the debate in France. And there's an element of comparison which I find particularly revealing, which is the fact that in the US, according to polls, Catholics tend to be more favorable than the population on average concerning gay marriage. And as you know, that's the opposite in the French context. That's an indication of how we should not presume that we know how it works before we've checked how it works. That is, we cannot expect, just because we know something, say, about the Catholic Church, that we'll know how Catholic voters react on such issues. What matters is not just a sort of abstract, universal cultural logic, but political context and historical context, which is very much the kind of argument that I tried to do. One last reason why we're having this on April 1st is that in 2001, the Netherlands was the first country to open marriage to same-sex couples on April 1st. Now, that makes a difference, because in fact, some of the arguments that have been used in France about, and I will return to this, but about the universality of sexual difference that makes it impossible to have such a thing as same-sex marriage, have been empirically weakened by the dissemination of same-sex marriage. Now, what I want to do is to expand on this with a line that I have tried to develop in the last 15 years, or 20 years actually, that is even before discussions about same-sex marriage, a critique of culturalism. The use of the comparison between France and the US, for me, is precisely that it helps undermine the illusion that we can understand something about France because it's essentially French, or something about the US because it's essentially American. And one of the interests for me of having tried to think about this comparison for a long time is that you can see how both sides have changed considerably. And in particular, it seems to me that one element that is most surprising and most unexpected for people who've been interested in this issue for a long time is the evolution of public opinion in the US. It was difficult to assume 10 years ago that public opinion would evolve so rapidly in the US. It was very easy to rely on certain cultural assumptions that confirmed ideas that we had about the US. So this is the kind of arguments that I want to use. My critique of culturalism, I had a chance to try and develop many years ago during the PAX debate. We had a discussion with a colleague whose work I really respect and admire, Robert Nye, who we had this confrontation about PAX, and his argument was, how can we understand the fact that there's so much resistance in France to PAX? And he found good historical reasons why the French might be reluctant to open some kind of a civil union to same-sex couples. I was more interested in the opposite versions. That is, how is it possible that it could change? Not only because of my reluctance to engage in a culturalist argument, but also because I'm interested in this issue politically. That is, if you want to think about the possibility of change, then you have to have a good theoretical reason for thinking that it's possible. Because if you find good reasons why things cannot change, then of course it doesn't help to have any kind of a political engagement on these issues. One element that is quite interesting to compare France and the US is the evolving place of religion. 15 years ago, when the debate about the PAX took place, One striking moment, which I have analyzed in the past, was when Christine Boutin, fervent Christian, intervened in the public assembly, in the National Assembly, with a Bible. And this was criticized on all sides. Everyone agreed that in France, we don't do that. We're not supposed to have Bibles in the National Assembly. That's un-French. Why? Because French, it was argued, is secular. By contrast, of course, when I told this story in the US, everyone was laughing because, of course, in the US, you're bound to have a Bible in the National Assembly. All of a sudden, my voice resonates more. For reasons I don't even want to think about. And so what struck me at the time is that it was very tempting to think, well, this has to do with eternal France, eternal secular Republican France on the one hand. On the other hand, this has to do with the sort of eternal religious America. However, things have changed. And it helps realize how these are not to be understood as eternal qualities. In the case of France in particular, what we've seen in the last few months is the overwhelming presence of religion in the debate. And the solidarity between political parties on the right and religious institutions. So instead of this eternally secular France, what we see is that secularism today means, in fact, that you can have in the streets people representing the Catholic Church demonstrating alongside people representing right-wing party. That's quite a different view, I think, from what people assumed was essentially French 15 years ago. So I want to try and see why has there been such a shift. Well, one element is that 15 years ago in the French debate on the PACs, and I will focus mostly on the French debate, but I will draw a few comparisons at times with the American situation. On the French side, 15 years ago, what we had, as you may recall, was a kind of anthropological argument. The idea was that the essence of culture was at stake. And some refer to psychoanalysis, some refer to anthropology per se, and some refer to religion. All three coincide, strangely. But what was interesting to me is that this perception of an anthropological logic seemed very exotic from an American point of view. And I want to say one thing about this. How come it was necessary to resort to anthropological arguments in the French context? Why use Lévi-Strauss instead of the Bible? And I think the answer is that in France, and you can still see this in opinion polls, people are not supposed to be homophobic. You look at recent polls, for example, despite all the demonstrations that you've seen that didn't seem to be the opposite of homophobic, still you have more than 80% of the population that say that there's no problem with homosexuality. More than 80%. And people who say it might be a problem, you have about 7% who say it's a perversion, and 6% who say it's a disease. But that means only 13%. So 87 on one side and 13 on the other. So basically, no one in France is homophobic, which is great. What it means is that if you're against gay marriage, you cannot just say it's because there's a problem with gays, since we're not homophobic. So the way you're going to justify opposing same-sex marriage is by having other kinds of arguments that have nothing to do with gays. It has everything to do, say, with sexual difference, which is very different, of course, from sexual orientation. So no one is homophobic. Therefore, if you want to be against it, the only way to be against it is to find other kinds of arguments, hence the fact that people have resorted to anthropological arguments. Now, what is interesting is that when we look today, these anthropological arguments that were used at the time, including by the church, have more or less disappeared. You don't hear so much psychoanalysis in vogue. You don't hear so much Lévi-Strauss in vogue. How come? Well, the first reason, in my opinion, is that it didn't work the first time, and so it's difficult to use it the second time. So basically, if you say there are universal laws established by such important writers as Lévi-Strauss and Lacan, etc., well, how come it's been possible to have this pax in the first place? And how come it's possible also to have it in the Netherlands? How come it's possible to have it in Belgium, etc., etc.? So universal laws that stop at the borders of France seem less universal. So in many ways, the argument is now less about culture, but more about our culture. Which of course is something that was familiar in the US. I mean, there was something about the Bowers v. Hardwick decision that insisted on the fact that, yeah, no, it's not part of our culture. We don't do that. We Americans don't do that. And because of the Bible, but also because of the specific American culture. That's relatively new in the French context because, in fact, the idea was that we embodied universalism and therefore there was no specificity of this issue. Now, the fact that today it's less anthropology and more, if you will, ethnology, that is, more our culture and less culture per se, is not the only element that has changed. There's a second element, which I think is equally important. It's the importance of biology. Biology was not used so much as an argument during the discussions about the Pax. I think it has played a much more important role in the last few years. The prelude to this was 2 years ago, the debate about the introduction of the so-called theory of gender in biology textbooks in high schools. You may recall that at first the attack was launched again by Christine Boudin, who is the spokesperson for Catholic associations in France, and then by the so-called droit populaire, whose competence on biology had not been most visible until then, because the focus had been on immigration issues. Now, what was interesting is that this attracted a lot of attention. And in fact, you had many deputies and you had many senators who joined in saying that it would be a major problem to introduce the so-called theory of gender in biology textbooks. Now, of course, they didn't invent this issue. They borrowed this issue from Vatican theology. Vatican theology, and this is one of our connections, as we discovered a common interest for this sex production in the Vatican. Difficult passion to confess. So what was interesting about this is that, of course, the Vatican has been developing arguments against gender, starting with the Beijing conference in 1995. And one of the ways in which gender could be opposed, since the fear was that gender would denaturalize society, and in particular denaturalize sexual difference, and also denaturalize the institutions that today embody, so to speak, sexual difference, such as marriage and the family. So the fears of Vatican were that the world would be denaturalized, and therefore natural law should return at the center of Vatican theology, but not just natural law conceived as the laws of nature. That is, instead of being divine reason, it's more and more biology. So it's God as nature, if you will. And this you have seen, for example, in recent pronouncements by the Pope, arguing for human ecology. Human ecology, as the Pope explained, of the former Pope Benedict, as he explained in 2011, I believe, just before Christmas, he explained that the problem with our ecology is that we're only interested in tropical forests, and we should also be interested in heterosexual marriage. A comparison that I leave to your interpretation. A sort of Hobbesian view, it seems to be, of heterosexual marriage. Now, what was interesting is that this argument of human ecology has been influential because you find this argument and this phrase, human ecology, used by the main rabbi in France, Gilles Delame, in a text that he published during the recent debate on same-sex marriage in France, a text that was widely circulated because it was presented by many as a very reasonable text opposing same-sex marriage. Now, this religious rehabilitation of nature is interesting, but there's another question, which is, why has religion been rehabilitated in public discourse? And it seems to me that if you compare 1997 to 1999 to today, you can see the difference. The church is not in the closet any longer. It's very much in the streets. Now, how come? Well, it seems to me that this has very much to do with the years of Nicolas Sarkozy and the discussions about national identity. As we know, national identity, as it was defended by Nicolas Sarkozy, was presented on the one hand as this secular France that we all believe in, and as this essentially Catholic France that we all believe in. So it was simultaneously eternally secular France and eternally Catholic France, the conjunction of the two being the essence of national identity. So in many ways, the fact that religion was instrumentalized politically as part of our national identity gave political prominence to religion. And in many ways, it's not surprising that you see the same people in the streets side by side in the name of religion or in the name of politics. It's not exactly new. That's what's been happening in France in the last few years. So the only difficulty, of course, being that of Islam, and I will return to this in a minute. Now, what I want to argue now is that all this evolution that's taking place in France helps rephrase the question that we could start with. We started with the question, what's specific about what's going on in France, and what interests me, in fact, is more how things have changed. That is, how it's not something that is inherent in French culture, but how it's the politics of French culture. So how it's not national identity, but the politics of national identity that are at stake. So the comparison between France and the US is not a comparison between two national identities, but between battles, political battles in both countries about the interpretation, the definition of national identity. And one element for understanding this, I think, is race. And this is what I want to develop now. That is, it seems to me that many of the differences that we can see between the debates in France and in the US have to do with race. I'll start with one issue that has been very much central in my understanding of the debates taking place in both countries for the last 15 years. It's the difference between what I have called the sacralization of marriage in the case of the US and the sacralization of so-called filiation in the case of France. Filiation, that is, the legal institution of the family through adoption, through access to reproductive technologies, and also through biological reproduction. A sacralization of marriage in the US, because it seems to me that the debate that is taking place in the US even today says little about the issue of filiation. There's, in fact, it's a different issue. The discussion about whether people should adopt or not, whether they should have access to reproductive technologies or not, is largely separate from the discussion about marriage per se. Only perhaps as a way of saying, since gays and lesbians already have kids, we might as well give them marriage. But in France, as you know, it works the other way around. That is, it's one thing to give them marriage, but should we want to go so far as to give them more, that is, adoption rights and rights in terms of reproductive technologies? So it's the opposite version, and that's not new. Now, how can we interpret this? And you see this in polls, for example, the fact that in France people are more likely to approve of marriage than to approve of adoption, and more likely to approve of adoption than to approve of access to reproductive technologies, and I will return to this. Now, my argument has been for a while that this has to do with race, that is the fact that marriage is a racial issue in the US. In particular, the question of children born out of wedlock is an extremely racialized issue, as was indicated by the joke that Obama made a couple years ago when he said that he's been accused of everything by Fox News, including of having fathered children in wedlock. And it seems to me that the joke says much about the racial implications of all this. Whereas it seems to me that the debate in France about filiation and the sacralization of filiation has to do with race, but in a different way. It has to do with immigration with who's French, because the issue of who's French has been more and more defined in racial terms, that is, terms of origin, la souche, l'origine. And it seems to me that these terms have played an important role in saying that blood matters in defining French citizenship today more than it did before. Hence, this insistence on people who are not just immigrés, but who can be second generation or third generation or fourth generation immigrants, which means they've been French forever, but they're still considered immigrés. Now that says something about race, and that says something about blood. Now, what is interesting for me is that this has been central in all the discussions in France in the last 15 years. At the same time as we had this debate about filiation, which was a debate about the family, there was a debate about filiation in a different sense about citizenship, who's French and who's not. And so it seems to me that the only reason why we seldom link the two debates is because the specialists of gender and sexuality tend not to be the specialists of immigration, the specialists of immigration and citizenship. And in fact, it seems to me that connecting the two fields is one of the ways to perceive how the same issues are taking place, both concerning filiation as family and concerning filiation as citizenship. One clear example is that of binational marriages. Why have binational marriages become such an issue in France? Well, clearly the fact that they're called mariage blanc or mariage gris should be an indication, a subtle hint that race may have something to do with it. And so it seems to me that the racial issue that is inscribed in filiation was very much implicit in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But I think it has become more and more explicit. But before I make this point, I want to elaborate on what I just mentioned without saying more about it, the difference between adoption and access to reproductive technologies in the French public debate. What I find particularly interesting is that you may have heard that François Hollande announced a few days ago that he would follow the advice of the National Ethics Council on the issue of access to reproductive technology, and everyone who knows the story knows immediately that it means it's not going to happen. Now, why would the government, apart from technical reasons that made it necessary to separate the issue of marriage and adoption from the issue of access to reproductive technologies that are not directly linked to marriage, why should it be more of a problem to open up access to reproductive technologies than to adoption? Why is it different? Well, again, this has to do with biology and with the return of biology as a founding logic in today's political debates in France. Although it's biology in a paradoxical way, that is, it's biology not just as a fact, but as a story that is told by filiation. The laws on adoption and being about access to reproductive technologies, the laws are quite different. The laws on adoption are explicitly artificial, if you will. That is, you can adopt either as a single person or as a married couple, but you cannot adopt as a couple if you're not married. Whereas in the case of reproductive technologies, you cannot have access as a single woman, for example, to artificial insemination. But if you want to have access as a couple made up of a man and a woman, you needn't be married. So it's the opposite logic. One is explicitly artificial, the other one looks like the reproductive act. And for example, there's an insistence on the fact that for access to reproductive technologies, you should be of procreative age, which is not the case for access to adoption. So the natural side is supposed to be on the side of reproductive technologies. Now, one element of this, the fact that it looks like nature, it looks like two people in a bed who have a child normally. what is the price to pay for preserving this fiction of this apparently, ostensibly natural fiction? The price to pay is what is called in today's debates vraisemblance. Vraisemblance means it has to look true, verisimilitude. It's not just plausible, but it has to resemble truth. Now, the price to pay for this is race. That is, the main thing about adoption today is that it tends to be international adoption, which means that vraisemblance is not a founding value in today's adoption practices. And in fact, if you want to adopt a child and you say, I'm white, I only want to adopt a white child, you might be considered racist. On the other hand, if you want to have access to reproductive technologies, race is there. That is, there's a selection of the eggs, and there's a selection of the sperm to make sure that there's the same hair color, that there's the same eye color, and that there's the same skin color. So race is very much central in the practices of reproductive technologies today, and this, of course, has to do with this idea that we should preserve this vraisemblance. It has to look like biology. And therefore, biology, of course, means race. Now, what I want to develop now in 5 minutes is how these racial issues have been reshaped in the last few years. The first thing that I would like to point out is that there's been a big debate in Europe in the last 10 years, which has resulted in terms such as sexual nationalism or homo-nationalism. What does that mean? That means that the instrumentalization of what I call sexual democracy, that is values of liberty and equality in terms of gender and sexuality, the instrumentalization in terms of race and in terms of immigration has been central. The idea that the difference between us and them has to do not with race, because we don't believe in biology theoretically, but with the fact that they, whatever that means, they do not share our democratic values. That is, they don't believe in equality between men and women. They don't believe that gays are okay, etc., whereas, of course, we do. So this instrumentalization of values of sexual democracy in immigration policies and in racialized discourse throughout Europe has been quite important, and Nicolas Sarkozy was quite explicit about this, at least on the heterosexual side. As you know, he was more interested in heterosexuality since he proclaimed that he was born a heterosexual or a born heterosexual. It's not clear, just unique heterosexuality. So Nicolas Sarkozy insisted on the fact that that's one of the big differences between us and them, and that helps justify, in terms that have nothing to do with racism, the fact that we don't like them. Now, what is interesting is that there has been a reaction against this. For example, there was recently in the debate on same-sex marriage in France, there was a pronouncement by the spokeswoman for the Indigènes de la République, the natives of the Republic, Ouria Betelja, who explained repeatedly that basically the issue of gay marriage was irrelevant for people in her movement because in the banlieue they have other problems. On one hand, that is, they have other priorities, but also because after all, yes, indeed, there is some homophobia in the banlieue, but so what? And finally, she argued that there was something also that the risk that she was more worried about was gay imperialism, that is the imposition of gay identity defined in the West onto not only other countries but also onto the banlieue. I will not discuss this at length, although, as you may have guessed, I'm not fully convinced by some arguments. Now, this is only one reaction, but one that I find interesting as a sort of symmetrical version to the homo-nationalist version. In some ways, it says, yes, you're right. We will emphasize racial issues, and we will forget about sexual issues. So it's the opposite of the instrumentalization of sexual democracy. It's the mirror version, in my view. But there's also another debate that was quite interesting. There was this morning as well in France Antilles, online, there was an announcement that the law on same-sex marriage would leave out the Antilles. The overseas would be left out of this. And of course you had to remember there was April Fool's Day. But what it showed is something that people have been thinking about. That is, the tensions about whether this is a French thing, not for the colonies, for the overseas. It's not for others, it's for us, etc. This has been very much part of the debate. And in fact, there's the deputy named Azero, who in the National Assembly, deputy from Martinique, who insisted that in our culture, we cannot condone this. In our culture, he said. And that was interesting because, in fact, this is a left-wing deputy. So he's breaking ranks with the left to say, in our culture, we can't do that. Now, what is interesting is that when Azero says this, he's playing on this racialization of the issue of gay marriage in ways that are very visible. But the part that I'm interested in and that I want to finish with is how it's been reversed by Christiane Taubira, who's the Minister of Justice in the recent debates. Christiane Taubira is going to have a law that has her name, la loi Taubira, which is going to be a law on same-sex marriage in a few weeks. But she already had a law that has her name, and it's the 2001 law on slavery. The recognition of slavery in the history and memory of France. Now, I think it's quite interesting that she embodies both, and she's been very careful during the public debate to always make this connection obvious. The first speech that she gave concluded with a quotation of Léon Gontran Damas, a poet from Guyane, her home territory, country, land. And what is department? What is interesting is that when she referred to him, then a discussion ensued. That is, she was attacked by a right-wing deputy who said, "You're quoting Damas, but Damas did not believe in assimilation. He believed in difference, and you want to erase difference." So a debate was taking place about the interpretation of what a poet from Guyane was saying, or had said. And she responded by quoting at length this poet, displaying more culture, surprisingly, than her opponents. What was interesting is that this racial discussion continued throughout all this. In particular, she responded to Azero, the deputy from the Antilles. And she responded by saying, "How dare you, basically, how dare you invoke the history, the legacy of slavery to say that we should not support same-sex marriage, as he had." And she turned it around by saying, it's precisely as descendants of slaves that we should favor opening marriage, because we know the importance of freedom, and we know in particular the importance of the freedom to marry. So instead of saying you have to make a choice, either you indulge gays and lesbians, or you listen to people of color, which is in many ways what Azero was saying. She's saying it's the same story. It's not either sex or race, it's a combination of both. So she's providing an alternative narrative for thinking about the connections between race and gender and sexuality, which I think is very important. And the fact that she's been such a visible, with all the implications of this term, in a country where the term visible minorities refers to non-whites. So the fact that she's been so visible, including in her clothing in the National Assembly, where the colors were flamboyant, if I can use that term, I think the visibility that she tried to play has something to do with this reversal of the meaning of race and sex. Now, I'll conclude with one comparison. She is doing something which I think is comparable to what happened in the US in some ways. You may recall that Proposition 8, which is under discussion today in front of the Supreme Court, Proposition 8, when it was voted, coincided with the election of Barack Obama. And at the time, there was a feeling that it had been a great day for African Americans and a bad day for gays. And so the idea that it's either one or the other was part of the story, including because there were some figures that were published in a poll showing that apparently in California, 70% of black voters had supported Proposition 8 much more than Latinos, who were 53, or than whites, who were about 50. I will not get into the discussion of the figures, but at least the idea that blacks, African Americans in California did not support gay rights became part of the story. And there was a big discussion with all kinds of arguments in all directions. It seems to me very interesting that Barack Obama, in his inaugural speech, when he referred to the issue of marriage for same-sex couples, made this phrase that refers to the constitutional principle of truths that we hold self-evident, but gave a narrative which starts from Seneca Falls, goes on to Selma, and then goes on to Stonewall. That is, from the 19th century, 1848, women's the founding moment of a women's movement, to Selma, crucial for civil rights in 1965, to Stonewall, crucial to gay rights, to gay and lesbian rights in 1969. So it seems to me that basically what Barack Obama was saying was equivalent to what Christiane Taubira was saying. That is, instead of saying there are separate issues that can be competing issues, both have argued that you can connect these issues. And it seems to me that it's a complete reversal from what I described that happened in the late 1990s. In the late 1990s, and I will finish with that, in France, what happened? We were told we cannot open filiation because it would be unnatural. And we have to preserve something like the French race. But also we have to preserve something like French marriage. Today, it's precisely in the name of race that someone like Christiane Taubira can say, well, racial issues and sexual issues are not in opposition, as we heard in the years 2000, but they're not working together to just block any progress or any questioning of norms. On the contrary, it's through race that you can question the sexual order, and through sex that you can question the racial order. And that's why I think it's an interesting moment, that it's not just the repetition of something eternally French or something eternally American. It seems to me that the reconfiguration of these articulations between sex and race are quite remarkable in both countries. Thank you very much.
Delighted to follow because every single one of the topics that we took up, in particular the role of religion, the role of sex and gender, the role of expertise, the role of biology, to a much lesser extent in my talk, the role of race, to a much greater extent the role of law, are things I want to talk about. I'm going to start, however, with something that Éric did not mention. And I'm going to quibble with the title of this presentation. I apologize to the organizers. It talks about the gay marriage debates, which is not something I would ever have wanted to discuss. I wouldn't even in this context want to discuss the same-sex marriage debates, which is what I often talk about across the street at the law school. Rather, I think it's interesting to start the comparison with what the proponents of the opening up of marriage to same-sex couples are calling their movement, respectively, in France and in the United States. In France, of course, Éric mentioned, it's mariage tous, marriage for everyone. But interestingly, of course, it's not marriage for everyone because the pax remains available to both couples of the same and of opposite sexes. And there is not this movement that everyone should marry. I believe the pax is not threatened at all by the opening of mariage for tous, either as a legal institution or as a practical alternative for lots and lots of people who live their life without marrying. By contrast, in the United States, the proponents speak of marriage equality. And I think that they're doing that very carefully with respect, to be respectful of those many people in the gay rights movement and outside of it who are doubtful that marriage should have the central role it does in American law and life, and call for equality on the premise if there is going to be marriage, then it should be open to all sorts of couples, not there should be marriage. Nevertheless, while mariage pour tous is not marriage for everyone in France, marriage equality has turned into marriage for everyone in the United States. And when I debate, much less congenial than being on the same platform with Éric, but something I do more often, the likes of Maggie Gallagher of the National Organization for Marriage, who claims that she is not homophobic, but simply a proponent of marriage, what I regularly say to her, and she hasn't given an answer to yet, is if you are serious that marriage is what you are promoting and preserving marriage and saying that people who are going to have children ought to be married, everyone ought to be married, you should be kissing the feet of gay people, because nothing has revitalized marriage for everyone in the United States the way the same-sex marriage movement has done, both as a matter of law. Alternatives to marriage are much less talked about, much less available, and as a matter of social practice, the notion is that everyone ought to be married. I recently learned of the engagement of an old friend of mine, old in the 12th census, someone I've known a long time, someone who is entering into his first marriage as a senior citizen, and I said, why are you getting married? Because the woman I'm marrying's children think our mother shouldn't be hanging around with somebody if she's not getting married. The children are in their early 30s. I don't think that they would have said that, but for the re-sacralization of marriage in the United States through the same-sex marriage movement. And I now want to turn to sacralization and the role of religion, because a running theme of my remarks is going to be things that are in some sense the exact opposite of what they appear. Mariage pour tous is not that, whereas marriage equality is mariage pour tous. It is also the case that in both France and the United States, that which should not be talked about, which cannot be on its face a justification against recognizing same-sex marriage, is driving a lot of the debate, and that's the role of religion. In France, you've got a commitment to the ACT. In the United States, anyone who's got just a colloquial knowledge of the First Amendment, of the separation of church and state, should be shocked the way religious and civil marriage are imbricated with one another in the United States and have been since the founding, such that a minister of the gospel can simultaneously and seamlessly do both a civil and a religious marriage. A marriage license is not a license for the couple to marry. It's a license for the minister from the state to marry them. So that, and if someone religiously authorized to perform a marriage does so without legal significance, he or she is guilty of crime in most states, not as in 18th century England a death penalty offense, only a misdemeanor, but religious and civil marriage are terribly imbricated. I think it is equally true in France that while France is unique, French legal notions of marriage and of family life have been influenced by Catholic notions of marriage, and Service has recently written some nice stuff about this. What has happened in the United States is that, as I have been fascinated to note, Catholics are much more supportive of same-sex marriage than, for a long time, all other groups, 20% gap between Catholics and others. Not that the hierarchy of the Catholic Church isn't opposed to same-sex marriage, but I've argued often in the past that the Catholic Church, that ordinary Catholics are not threatened by same-sex marriage because marriage as the state defines it and as their religion defines it, are carefully kept apart in their minds. Every Catholic and every observant Jew knows full well that civil marriage and religious marriage are not the same, because in both cases they know that it's possible to be married to one person in the eyes of the state and the other in the eyes of the faith. Protestants in the United States don't know that. And this is why the objection to same-sex marriage that gets laughed at, which is our marriages will be threatened by same-sex marriage, is exactly right when spoken by, in particular, evangelical Protestants. Because Protestants in the United States have the same relationship to civil marriage that they for a long time had to the public schools. They had a nominally state-sponsored institution that they had co-opted for sectarian ends and developed an understandable, though not justifiable, sense of grievance when that domination and control is threatened. So in public schools, you've got prayer in the schools, the Bible, the 19th century Bible wars, prayer in the schools in the middle of the 20th century, evolution debates still going on today. Similarly, with respect to marriage, there's no air between marriage as Protestants define it to their flock and as the state defines it. In particular, the Protestants have not juridified the dissolution of marriage the way Catholics have through annulment and Jews have through the get in. But even beyond that, the rules of marriage. So one of my favorite fun facts on this score is that it wasn't until 1999, or until the 1990s, that the Southern Baptist Conference declared it to be part of Baptist doctrine, that it was a wife's duty graciously to submit to her husband's servant leadership. Now, it wasn't a new concept for the Baptists that wives should be subordinate to husbands, submissive to husbands in the late 20th century. But until that time, they had been able to count on the state to do it for them. And that time was in the immediate aftermath of the constitutional revolution against sex discrimination led by former Columbia professor and litigator, now Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who made it impossible for the law to impose hierarchical sex roles on husbands and wives, or even differentiated by sex roles on husbands and wives. Which leads me to the second thing that the question of the role of sex and gender. So another thing that cannot be talked about in the United States and is central to the debates in France is sex differentiation as a justification against same-sex marriage. Why is that? Because in the United States, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg anti-sex discrimination revolution got there first, so that by the mid-1980s, it was unequivocally constitutional law in the United States that there could be no fixed roles concerning the role, fixed notions concerning the roles and abilities of males and females embodied in law, and in particular in the law of marriage. A lot of the cases that Ginsburg litigated were about married couples, were some about domination and subordination, about male control over assets, but some just about role differentiation. Clearly there cannot be stereotypes concerning the roles and abilities of males and females in American law. That hasn't gotten through to all of the lower court judges. I'm fond of quoting my, I'm ashamed to say, personal friend, Judge Robert Smith, who wrote the New York same-sex marriage opinion, who said that intuition and experience suggested that it might be better for children to grow up with living images before them on a daily basis of what a man and a woman are like. And my standard line on this is, given the constitutional prohibition against stereotypes, it can only have been arguing for more nudity in the home, that there cannot be anything that a man and a woman are like, unless what he was arguing, in which I sort of recognize same-sex marriage, that a man and a woman aren't like anything in particular. But in any event, at the level of constitutional law, this argument cannot be on the table in the United States, although it is central to the motives of many of the religious and some of the non-religious opponents of same-sex marriage. So David Blankenhorn, who has now had a new revelation concerning same-sex marriage, the only expert witness actually to testify for the Prop 8 side, started out arguing against single motherhood, in particular poor black single motherhood, and in favor of, and he used this word favorably, the patriarchy. We needed to re-establish the patriarchy and the role of the fathers and sex role differentiation. Now, as recently as the Prop 8 oral arguments, I was fascinated to see Cooper, the lawyer arguing for the Prop 8 proponents, saying that the risk to same-sex marriage was that there would be genderless marriage, and genderless marriage was something very worrisome. Now, this gets to a personal, quibble is too weak and tragedy is too strong of mine, that arguments based in the notion of sex discrimination being a constitutional problem have not been front and center in the same-sex marriage debates, particularly in the same-sex marriage debates before the Supreme Court. I was particularly sorry that they weren't when Justice Kennedy, which we all know is a swing voter, asked, unfortunately, Cooper, is this actually a gender-based classification? And of course, Cooper said no. And if it were seen as a sex-based classification, it would be clearly unconstitutional. But note that this is gender-based rather than sex-based. This gets me back to the role of sex and gender in the French debates. It has also seemed to me more than a quibble and just slightly less than tragic that since the time of the French Revolution, the French have been unwilling to extend to women the full, equal, impersonal citizenship that the revolution established for all men. Women lost voting rights in the French Revolution that they had had since the estates of Philip the Fair in the 14th century. They didn't get them back until after World War II. And Parité has re-enshrined something like a Vatican notion of complementarity in French law, that it takes both males and females to complete the human race, and that we are not, as Ratzinger, as Benedict XVI reminds us, merely human, that it is dangerous. I'm wearing my human bracelet because that's the identity group I wish to belong to. So one of the things that Ratzinger and John Paul II and some of the talking heads in the French debate, my personal favorite is the Lacanian priest Tony Amatrella, have focused on is this notion that sexual complementarity, by which they don't mean what Robbie George, who is the American natural law theorist from a Catholic perspective, propounded this means, a purely biologistic notion of sexual complementarity, and insert tab A into slot B notion that the genitalia are complementary. What they do mean is what became clear from these debates about the textbooks, that it is dangerous to suggest exactly what Ruth Bader Ginsburg persuaded us was our constitutional commitment. It was so persuasive that even Justice Rehnquist wrote one of his last important opinions saying, we were so committed to this that the federal government can impose it on the states, there should be no stereotypical notions of the roles and behaviors of males and females. Whereas in the French context, the notion that there is anything but essential sex difference, that culture plays a role, was seen as so problematic that the hundreds of deputies, not just those led by the Catholic Church, demanded the withdrawal of the textbooks that embody this dangerous gender theory. And so gender, which the Vatican has set its face against, has two meanings, both of which are dangerous to a Catholic notion of complementarity that leads to opposition to same-sex marriage in France. One is the way that people on this side of Amsterdam Avenue would use the term, that is to say, the one favored among women's and gender studies folks, that gender is the socio and cultural overlay on biological sex. The other is the way that Ruth Bader Ginsburg put it into law, in American law, which migrated to international law, to the Beijing Conference, which is not that gender is a social construction, but that gender is a synonym for sex. But when gender is used as a synonym for sex in law, associated with a vision that says there is no fixed biological difference important to the law, that differences should be, that stereotype differences should not be the basis of legal categories. So things have been open to the French that are foreclosed to the Americans with respect to saying we need to reinforce gender differences, not just biological sex, and this is a reason for opposing same-sex marriage. Now, Éric said that holding up the Bible was viewed as scandalous in France, and it clearly wouldn't have been on the floor of the U.S. Congress. One other thing should be mentioned, which is that because religion cannot be explicitly discussed, there was this move from theological anthropology to philosophical anthropology, and this shift from religion to psychoanalysis. And famously, someone got up on the floor of the French Assembly and said it would destroy the symbolic order if couples of the same sex could get married. And I think Americans would agree that no one would have any idea what was being talked about if someone got up on the floor of Congress and said it would destroy the symbolic order. Moreover,
some French had no idea.
Exactly. But so arguments from psychoanalysis, even Freud, let alone Lacan, have interestingly not been on the table in the United States. But I also want to talk about the different ways in which expertise is used. Anthropology versus sociology, the abstract versus the concrete, the empirical versus the theoretical. Again, a lot of what is happening, it seems to me, of vast distance in France, is that there's a slippage between theological and philosophical anthropology. And the claim is made that not just the kids actually raised by same-sex couples, but all children. At least this was a claim made at the time of the Pax. I gather it's receded. But all children might grow up psychotic if sex differences were not precisely embodied in law. The idea of same-sex marriage would destroy us. And I am troubled that the Pope's quote about the rainforest gets too limited an interpretation onto the question of hetero and homosexuality, when it seems perfectly clear in context that the Pope was talking about the general sweep of fixed notions concerning the roles and abilities of males and females. The tagline, Pope says heterosexuality endangered by like the rainforest, is associated with a speech in which he talks about the nature of the human being as male and female. I find it very fascinating that the Vatican believes that there is more connection than, unfortunately, I know there to be between all kinds of movements like the feminist movement, the reproductive rights movement, the movement to reform family law, the gay rights movement. All of these things the Pope connects up as embodied in a so-called gender agenda, whereas there isn't the same seeing of connections and making of political alliances, and therefore not the same power. So when the Pope compares the proponents of the gender agenda to, or says that there's a human ecology that we need to preserve, I feel that the Pope sees people like me, like Éric as well, probably most of you in this room, as the equivalent for the nature of human beings as environmentalists see lobby companies. We are going to clear cut through human nature. Fascinates me that he thinks that it is possible. He thinks it would be a really bad idea to destroy human nature. but he thinks just as it is possible to destroy the rainforest, it is possible to destroy complementarity, which in some sense concedes that it is a bit of a social construction, or at least malleable. So the other thing about expertise that I would say is very abstract in France, very particular in the United States. We look, if at all, to evidence-based studies of how same-sex families are actually doing. And interestingly, that gets turned, the better the studies are for the same-sex families, it turns out at the Supreme Court, the worse it is for their prospects to marry. Justice Roberts pointed out that given that the same-sex families were doing so well, the argument that they needed marriage to either protect their rights on a practical level or protect their rights on a symbolic level, perhaps that case had not been made. I've lost track of how much time do I have.
Me too.
Okay, so I will.
I think we need to.
Yeah. So I will just say one small thing about the comparative role of race, and second, the notion that there are interesting things to be said about the comparison between slave experiences of the possibility of marriage and affiliation and gay experiences of the possibility of marriage and affiliation, and point out that Justice Scalia has a gift for saying exactly the wrong thing. I'm actually working on a piece called Deconstructing Scalia, in which I look, deconstructing in the old sort of Phyllis Miller textual sense, right? Take the text, put pressure on it, and the whole thing explodes. He did it again in the oral argument, when Justice Kagan said, what about two people who are 55 years old? If marriage is really for reproduction, why do you allow them to marry? He interjected that obviously Strom Thurmond had not been the chair of the Judiciary Committee when Elaine Kagan had the nomination hearings. And what he probably thought he had in mind was Strom Thurmond's habit of marrying in old age a series of white beauty queens. What putting pressure on the text opens up is that, of course, Strom Thurmond also had a child with a black servant in his family home, a servant whom he could not have married and, of course, would not have married. Stop.
Just briefly, because I don't want to take too much time, but one thing is an obvious difference, not just between our talks, but between the situations in France and the US, is the status of law. The very fact that we've been so careful about how law works and arguments work. If you compare with the fact that you had 170 legal scholars who published text in opposition to same-sex marriage with basically not one valid legal argument, recently says something on the fact that law is not that important in French debate. I think it's, of course, the law is important in that it defines the land, but not in theoretical debates, it seems to me. And the second thing that I wanted to point out about the presence of gender as a legal reality in France, there was the case of a trans marriage that was rejected by a court in 2005, and the problem was for the courts to justify how to forbid this marriage. And they had a hard time because, in fact, for the law, this was a man and a woman. These were two women who wanted to get married, but one had undergone surgery and the other one not, and therefore were still considered one as a man and the other as a woman. So how can you say no to this? It's very difficult. And so the court came up with a gender argument by saying that consent in marriage requires the intention to behave as man and wife. And so since these two women, and they couldn't say women because for the law it was a man and a woman, but since they did not intend to behave as man and wife, they couldn't be authorized to get married. which shows the lengths that they're willing to go to justify making life difficult. And just one last remark about when you compare the religion marriage thing, about civil marriage and religious marriage, just a reminder of the fact that in France you need civil marriage before you get religious marriage. So it's quite different from the US, but it's an important element because it's been used against Islam in particular with the suspicion that Muslims are getting married without going to the miri. And so I think that's